Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment, Leslie Mann, Cena and Ike Barinholtz are all trying to be a bunch of blockers to their teenage daughters. Catherine Newton's Julie, Geraldine Wishwanathan's Kayla, and Gideon Adlon's Sam have been best friends since they were kids, which means so too are their parents, Leslie Mann's Lisa, John Cena's Mitchell, and Ike Barinholtz's Hunter, respectively. On the day of their prom, Julie, Kayla, and Sam make a pact together to all lose their virginity. When their parents discover their plans, they race after them to try and stop them, but over the course of the night discover that they might be the ones who have some growing up to do. Blockers is the directorial debut of Kay Cannon, who wrote all three Pitch Perfect movies, which, come to think of it, might explain why that third film most recently was such an obvious rush job. But she didn't write this movie, I hasten to add. It's also produced by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, and when I saw that credit it made total sense, because when I was watching this movie, tonally it reminded me a lot of the Neighbours films. In fact, it even comes from the same production company of Good Universe. Now, I know a lot of people have been put off this movie because of the advertising. I don't think Universal has done a very good job of selling this movie, especially with the trailers they cut for it. Particularly the very first one, the Red Band trailer, is pretty much a compilation of the film's crassest moments in a 2-minute reel. And while those things are in the movie, I don't think it's indicative of the product as a whole. I think that tonally the movie is very different to how they've represented it. But when you combine that trailer with the premise of the movie of parents rushing out to defend their daughter's virginity, and the fact that it's got an MPAA baiting title like Blockers, where the references are alluded to in many of the promo materials with a rooster being on top of it, you'll note that's not actually in the film's own title card, which I think is an important distinction to make. You'll understand why some people have felt that this movie might be somewhat repellent or aggressive in its attitudes. It certainly didn't do me any favours. I wasn't hugely anticipating this movie, and so going in with fairly low expectations, I actually found myself very pleasantly surprised by Blockers. What helps the movie tremendously is that it's anchored by a trio of very solid comic performances in the form of Mann, Cena and Barinholtz, who are very likeable performers playing the parents, and that helps you empathise with them. The parents in this movie are all going through the same thing, in that their daughters are all grown up now, they're on the cusp of adulthood, and they're about to fly the nest, and they don't really know how to process that information, and they're all going through it in various different ways. Leslie Mann's Lisa, for example, is a single mother, so she's had to take care of her daughter all by herself, and she wants to remain close to her because she's been a part of her life for so long that she's afraid of being away from her, but her daughter considers that to be smothering, and you can see that in the small subplot in this movie where Lisa wants her daughter to go to the University of Chicago because the film is set in the Illinois area, but her daughter wants to go much further afield to UCLA. But there's also this paranoia in Lisa's mind, especially when she hears about the pact, that her daughter is going to do many of the same mistakes that she did in her youth, that she's going to experience the same hardships that she suffered, and she doesn't want that. Mann, I think, is probably the most experienced of the comic cast, and she's really great in this movie. I like Mann as a comic performer, and she handles the tone fairly well, I think. She doesn't make the character too shrill or overbearing, but you get a sense of the fact that she just generally wants the best for her daughter. You compare that with John Cena, who is arguably the least experienced from a comic point of view, but he's shown in the past that he does have the chops in movies like Trainwreck and Sisters, where he played small supporting roles that arguably stole the show in those cases. Here he's ascended up to a leading role, and he really goes for it. In fact, he's so committed that he bears his backside on several occasions. He is very, very game for a laugh. And yeah, Cena does still have that innate stiffness to him, but even so, that makes sense for the character, who is a little bit of a square in his own way. He wants to be his daughter's hero. He wants to be someone for her to look up to and to protect her, and as such, he doesn't really know how to handle his daughter's burgeoning sexuality. He's very squeamish about it and uncomfortable, and that's something that he really has to make peace with, and he's the typical overprotective dad. And while Cena is perhaps a little bit too jacked and buffed up to be playing a suburban dad, otherwise I think he's really well cast and his enthusiasm shows on screen. I think it's actually remarkable how much confidence he does show on screen. I think he's really come into his own as a comic performer. He really does very well in this movie. He carries some of the big set piece moments on his shoulders and he handles them beautifully. And Ike Barinholtz, his character of Hunter, he's sort of the member of the group that's most ostracised because he had an affair and has split up with his wife, played by June Diane Raphael of How Did This Get Made. She's moved on to a new husband who's played very briefly by Hannibal Buress. They're both in 2 scenes together, and they're kind of underutilised, disappointingly. Barinholtz is perhaps the most likeable I've seen him in any of his movies. Yes, he's still playing that kind of rough around the edges character, but there is a certain amount of humility to him because of his situation. He wants to come back into his daughter's life, Sam, and help her and try and make up for lost time, and he's aware that he has actually screwed things up. But what I think was most interesting about Barinholtz's character, and I think is representative of the writing of the film as a whole, is that he is not really with the other 2 parents when it comes to this whole mission of blocking their daughters. In fact, in the very earliest scenes of the movie, he's the voice of reason telling them, no, this is completely wrong, don't do this, and is trying to stifle them. And that's really good comic writing. Each of these characters has their very own distinct, recognisable personality. They're each approaching this from their own different viewpoints, and that gives the performances on screen a lot more to work with. They can bounce off of each other because they can bring those kind of motivations into the comedy. Although having said that, this isn't a very improvisation heavy comedy, or at least it doesn't appear to be, apart from 1 or 2 scattered moments, which I think is a very good thing. It certainly shows a lot of signs of discipline in the editing room, which is supremely good to report for a comedy, because I think that a lot of modern comedies these days are actually burdened more by improvisation than helped, in that they try and punch up a weaker moment on set, and what actually does is it results in a lot of freewheeling, baggy moments that should have been left on the cutting room floor because they slow down the movie and kill any momentum, and you're begging for them to just simply move on to the next bit. I never had that problem in Blockers. It always keeps a good pace, and I think that they've obviously tested this movie quite rigorously, so they know what bits worked and what bits didn't, and it's pretty tight in terms of its editing. I can understand why a lot of people are very hesitant about the movie's premise, because I could totally see a terrible movie being made out of it, and it's all a question of perspective, because if the movie viewed the parents as being in the right, if it was behind them and they had to rush out and save their daughters from making this terrible mistake, then that would be a really gross, awful, and questionably moralistic film, and what's worse, I could very easily see that being made. But it helps that there is a woman behind the camera. I think that Kay Cannon brings a different perspective to the usual sex comedy tropes. But it helps even further that the movie actually calls attention to the inherent problems with its premise, and does so several times, not just in the form of Ike Barinholtz's character, Cena's wife. There is a whole scene with her where she chastises the three of them for their behaviour and the fact that what they're doing is really messed up and wrong. This is completely inappropriate and actually very, very controlling. It's an example of them desperate to still have some form of control over their daughters' lives. However, I think in that scene in particular, it does backfire on the film just slightly. In that moment, and in that moment alone, it does read a little bit too close to soapboxing, in that there is just too much of the sort of a speech about it, and at that point you go, yes, I get it, I'm aware of what's going on, I know this is wrong, and we already had several scenes about it, I don't need to be told about this again. And the movie has a genuine affection for its teenage characters. I liked all three of the performers playing the daughters, and they had a chemistry with each other that made them feel like lifelong friends, and that made the movie feel a lot more authentic. It felt very well observed and recognisable, and the movie never asks us to cast judgment on their behaviour, nor should it, because these are young women making their own choices, their own decisions, and discovering things about themselves and their bodies that they need to do. It's about them making the transitions into adulthood and becoming the people that they will grow up into, and they don't need parents to interfere with that. So yes, they do drink and they do drugs. It simply presents them in a very matter-of-fact way of teenagers doing these things as a rite of passage, and doing these things because they want to, and in that way the movie is very positive and accepting in a way that surprised me greatly, I have to say. And this is especially the case with a key subplot with the character of Sam, who is a lesbian, but she's afraid to come out of the closet, and so she joins in this sex pact, but she gets a boyfriend to join in with her, and that's why Barinholtz joins in with the other parents, not because he wants to stop his daughter from having sex, but merely because he's afraid that she's succumbing to peer pressure in that way, having recognised that within his daughter, even though she hasn't come out to him yet. And the way the movie handles this plot line is very sensitively done, and I think the way it goes in the third act is really sweet and genuinely emotional to a certain extent. There is a genuine heart in this movie that can be very clearly seen in the way that it handles this particular character. And that's the balance that you need to make in a gross out comedy. Yeah, it can be lewd and disgusting, but you need to have an emotional centre. It's that sweet and sour combination that helps offset each other, and Blockers gets that just right, I think, for the most part. Although it does help that the big comedy set pieces, they are genuinely funny. If you've seen any of the advertising materials, you've no doubt seen the extremely prominent scene of Cena being duped into a butt-chugging contest. And I really am a bit annoyed that they've put so much emphasis on that scene, because they pretty much show you the whole thing, including the punchline. And for my money, that is arguably the movie's biggest moment. When I saw this with an audience, their eruption at that moment was practically volcanic. It was a tremendous laugh. Nothing in the movie came close to that, and they gave it away in the trailer. But I will say there are several other very big moments that did work on my audience very well, and I got a big chuckle out of a pair of scenes involving another set of parents played by Gary Cole and Gina Gershon, minus a lot of their clothes. Their kid has obviously gone to prom, so they're taking advantage of that by having a lot of sex games, and the two scenes sees our main parents getting involved in them in some kind of way, and those scenes really are hysterically funny. And the film, I think, yes, it does have a lot of gross moments in it, but it doesn't go too far over the top, I think. With the exception of one scene, there is a scene where the teenage characters, there is a sudden symphony of vomiting. They all start vomiting simultaneously. And that scene, I don't think quite works in the same way as others do in the rest of the movie. That one falls flat. But for the most part, I had a lot of real, genuine laughs in this movie, and it really helps that our central cast of Mann, Cena and Barinholtz, they all handle those scenes with gusto and real enthusiasm and sell them for all they're worth. Blockers isn't a great movie, but it is far and away better than it could have been given the storyline, and for that alone it deserves a certain amount of commendation. It's not exactly a movie that you need to rush out to go and see. If you're in the mood for something light and insubstantial to see on a lazy afternoon, be it at the cinema or simply flipping on Netflix, you could certainly do far worse than Blockers, which in its own way is fairly inclusive and aware of itself, which is a lot more than you can say for many of its peers. And while it's not a movie that's going to stick around in your memory, I do think that John Cena is showing a lot of signs in this movie of becoming a comic talent in his own right. I think he is really impressive in this movie. Despite the crass premise, Blockers is surprisingly sweet between the gross-out gags, far more so than it might look on the surface. The film's concept could have been potentially awful, but director Kate Cannon is far too aware to allow that to become the case, and calls attention to the parents' overprotective attitudes, if maybe to the point where it gets a little bit heavy-handed. It's also not judgmental about the teen leads, and even progressive, especially in regard to a sensitively handled coming-out subplot. This balances out the crude set pieces, which largely earn the right kind of yucks, which are played well by a likeable trio of comic performers in the form of Cena, Mann and Barinholtz, who bounce off each other nicely. A well-tuned laugh machine, Blockers shows that you can still be vulgar without sacrificing heart and sincerity. If you like this review, then you can chase after my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. I would do it.